Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. We're all about getting to the heart of complex topics quickly here, grasping those core ideas without getting lost in the weeds. And I have a feeling today's deep dive might be one of our most fascinating yet.
Oh, I think you might be right about that.
We've got some listener submitted material that takes a really unique look at the book of Revelation and tackles some pretty profound questions about, well, everything.
Yeah, Revelation is always a wild ride, right?
Yeah.
But this take is something else entirely.
It really is. So to give everybody a quick overview, we're dealing with a non-traditional interpretation here, one that sees some of the most iconic imagery and timelines of Revelation in a whole new light.
Right from the start, it's important for people to understand that we're venturing outside of mainstream interpretations here.
Exactly. And just to give you a taste of how different this interpretation gets, we're talking about seeing Satan, the great dragon of Revelation, not as a literal fallen angel, but as a representation of ego.
Yeah, the ego, that part of ourselves that constantly resists truth and spirituality.
And then there's the two-edged flaming sword, which in this view symbolizes absolute truth.
Impervious to deception, cutting through all the illusions ego creates.
And then, perhaps most strikingly, we have the interpretation of Babylon, often seen as Rome or some worldly empire, being portrayed as Israel.
It's a shift that definitely raises some eyebrows and challenges a lot of traditional understandings.
To say the least. And then there's the timeline that's laid out, which is equally unexpected. We're looking at a potential 1,000-year reign of Christ, starting around 33 AD and going all the way to 1030 AD.
So basically, the early church era and its rise to prominence.
Right, and that's followed by what's called Satan's little season, lasting another 1,000 years, give or take.
Which, according to some of the material you provided, could potentially wrap up right around now, even pointing to specific years like 2020 or 2030.
I know. It really makes you look at current events with a whole new perspective.
No doubt.
So, okay, let's start unpacking all of this, and maybe we can begin with this idea of Satan as ego. The dragon in Revelation is this huge, fearsome, opposing force. How does that translate to the concept of ego in this view?
It all comes down to seeing Satan not just as this external being, but as an embodiment of those self-centered tendencies that exist within each of us, those parts of ourselves that fight against truth and genuine spiritual growth. It's like saying the battle isn't just out there with some cosmic bad guy, but it's also an internal struggle we face every single day.
Right, so instead of some external devil figure, it's about managing our own self-centeredness. Okay, I can see how that reframes things.
Yeah.
Now, how does the two-edged flaming sword fit into this internal battle against ego? You mentioned it represents truth.
Exactly. It's that piercing, powerful force that slices through all the lies and deceptions ego throws our way. Think of it like this. As we potentially move out of this period where ego has been ruling the roost, this little season of Satan, truth takes center stage. It's what dismantles the illusions and reveals reality for what it truly is.
So ego is the adversary, and truth is the weapon to overcome it. That's a pretty potent analogy. Okay, let's get into this really intriguing and possibly controversial interpretation of Babylon as Israel. Traditionally, Babylon represents worldly power and corruption, often linked to Rome. Why the shift to Israel in this view?
Well, it's tied to what are known as preterist interpretations of Revelation, which see many of its prophecies as having been fulfilled in the 1st century AD.
Okay, so preterism is all about looking at the past to understand Revelation.
Right. And some preterist views connect Babylon to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, seeing it as a representation of a spiritual center that had become corrupted. And this interpretation kind of builds on that foundation, suggesting that during this long little season of Satan, this corrupted spiritual center, symbolized by Babylon as Israel, has continued in various forms. It's like a warning that even those things we hold sacred can become distorted by ego. But again, I want to emphasize this is a very specific lens through which to view this. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation.
For sure. Always good to keep that in mind. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this alternative timeline. 1,000 years of Christ's reign, followed by 1,000 years for, let's call it, ego's reign. That flips the script on a lot of typical end times thinking. Can you break down how this timeline plays out and what the thinking is behind these specific dates?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, this interpretation differs from the more common view, which often places a shorter period of tribulation before Christ's return and his 1,000-year reign. Here, it's almost like those time frames have been reversed. Some people might see the initial 1,000 years as lining up with the growth and spread of the early church, followed by this extended period where, well, things took a different turn.
Right, into this little season.
Exactly. Now, the idea that the apocalyptic age begins at Christ's death isn't totally unheard of in some Christian thought. It marks the start of the new covenant and the age of the church, after all. But what makes this interpretation stand out is the length of this little season, and the suggestion that history itself might have been manipulated during this time to mask the true extent of ego's influence.
Hold on. Skewed history. That's a bold claim. What's the logic behind that?
The thinking is that if ego has been the driving force for so long, it would naturally want to hold on to power and control the narrative. This could involve suppressing certain truths, rewriting historical events to fit a particular agenda, or promoting ideologies that reinforce self-centeredness. So from this perspective, the true nature of this little season might not be immediately apparent in mainstream historical accounts.
It's like questioning the stories we tell ourselves about the past and wondering if they're truly objective. So how do some of the other symbols in Revelation fit into this timeline and this whole concept of Satan as ego running things through a potentially corrupted spiritual center? Let's start with the beast that comes out of the sea, that classic image.
Traditionally, the beast from the sea is seen as the Antichrist, or a powerful worldly empire. Here it symbolizes the entire system that's been in place during this little season, a system driven by ego. The 7 heads and 10 horns could represent all sorts of powerful entities. Governments, organizations, maybe even aspects of science and technology when they're pursued without ethical or spiritual grounding. It's basically a symbol of ego's widespread influence.
Okay, so it's not just one person or empire, it's like an entire ego-driven network. And then there's that other beast, the one from the land, often called the false prophet, who supports the first beast. Where does that figure fit in?
That beast represents the false teachings and propaganda that prop up this ego-driven system. Things like media that promote selfish values, ideologies that put personal gain above everything else, and maybe even those distorted historical narratives we talked about. Anything that reinforces ego's grip on things is like the voice of the ego, justifying and spreading its agenda.
I see. It's like the PR team for the ego-driven system. And that leads us to the mark of the beast. What does that symbolize in this context?
Instead of just being a mark of allegiance to some individual antichrist, the mark here represents complete allegiance to this entire ego-driven system. It means choosing to live by the rules of ego, prioritizing self, material wealth, and power over truth and spirituality. It's a question of where your ultimate loyalty lies.
Right, like a pledge to the ego's way of doing things. And what about the infamous number 666, so often linked to the beast? Does that have a different meaning here too?
It does. Traditionally, it's seen as a symbol of imperfection, falling just short of the divine completeness represented by the number 7. In this framework, 666 emphasizes just how flawed and limited these ego-driven systems are compared to what's associated with God or a higher spiritual reality. It's a sign of inherent incompleteness, always falling short of true fulfillment.
I like that. It highlights the limitations of an egocentric approach. Now, we have this other powerful image, the woman clothed with the sun. Who is she in this interpretation?
The woman clothed with the sun is often interpreted as Mary or the church in more traditional views. Here she embodies true spirituality, the faithful remnant that resists the corrupted spiritual center in this case. That would be Israel. It suggests a distinction between a spiritual Israel, representing true faith, and a national Israel that's been influenced by ego during this little season.
So like a separation between genuine faith and potentially corrupted institutions and the lamb. That seems to be one symbol that remains fairly consistent.
Yes, the lamb still represents Christ, his sacrifice, humility, and the ultimate redemption from ego's grip. That symbolism remains central.
Okay, good to know. Now on to those iconic harbingers of doom, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. How do they ride in this ego-focused interpretation?
Think of each horseman as embodying a different aspect of ego's destructive influence during this little season. The white horse, conquest, becomes conquest driven by ego initial victories built on manipulation or falsehoods. The red horse, war, represents conflict fueled by pride and self-interest. The black horse, famine, isn't just about physical scarcity but a spiritual emptiness, a hunger for meaning that's never satisfied by ego's constant craving. And finally, the pale horse, death, symbolizes the ultimate endpoint of a world ruled by ego destruction and decay.
Wow, that's a bleak picture, but it definitely makes you think. Okay, so we're seeing how these symbols work together to paint this image of ego's long reign. What about those series of judgments, the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven bowls? What do they represent in this framework?
These series symbolize different stages in the process of, let's say, dismantling ego's hold. The seven seals might be initial warnings or consequences of ego's dominance. Some even link them to different phases of spiritual awakening or decline. The trumpets could represent louder wake-up calls or escalating consequences. And then the seven bowls, those are the final, most intense judgments, the ultimate fallout of an unrepentant, ego-driven system.
Okay, so it's like a gradual escalation toward a breaking point. And where does the New Jerusalem fit into all of this? Isn't that the ultimate symbol of restoration?
You got it. The New Jerusalem represents the restored kingdom of God, a state of being, maybe even a transformed earth, where truth and genuine spirituality reigns supreme after ego's influence has been overcome. It symbolizes a new era of harmony and direct connection with the divine. All the symbolic features, the perfect cube, the gates open to everyone, the absence of a chaotic sea, no need for a temple because God's presence is everywhere, streets paved with gold point toward this ultimate restoration. What's interesting is that this interpretation sometimes suggests that believers in Christ already have a kind of dual citizenship with this New Jerusalem through the church, hinting that this restored state might already be unfolding on a spiritual level as this little season comes to an end.
It's like saying the seeds of that new reality are already being planted. Okay, let's fast forward to the present moment. It's March 17th, 2025, as we're recording this. So how does this interpretation of the seven seals and seven bowls connect to what might be happening right now in the world?
Given the timeline we're working with, the idea that Satan's little season could be ending around now, maybe having already wrapped up in 2020 or stretching out to 2030, those events, symbolized by the later seals and especially the bowls, could very well be unfolding as we speak, or perhaps they've recently occurred. Remember, those judgments are all about purging the ego-driven system. And with Babylon being understood as Israel in this view, that would imply some pretty significant, potentially disruptive events happening in that region and rippling out to the global stage. And again, I want to emphasize the sensitivity needed when approaching this interpretation of Babylon as modern Israel. It's a perspective that demands respect for those who hold different views.
Absolutely. We're exploring one particular lens, one way of looking at things, and it's crucial to acknowledge that. You mentioned the establishment of Israel in 1948 falling within this time frame for Satan's little season. How does that fit into this interpretation?
In this non-traditional timeline, the establishment of Israel in 1948 would indeed fall within that roughly 1,000-year period attributed to ego's influence. From this perspective, it could be seen as part of that historical era marked by ego's dominance, especially considering this framework's interpretation of Babylon as Israel facing judgment later in Revelation. Again, it's essential to remember that this is a specific theological viewpoint, not a universally held belief.
Right, right. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the key ideas we've covered. We've explored a non-traditional understanding of Revelation where Satan isn't just some external devil figure, but a representation of those ego-driven tendencies within each of us. And the two-edged sword is the power of truth that cuts through ego's illusions. Then we have this controversial interpretation of Babylon as a corrupted spiritual center, possibly Israel. And we looked at this longer timeline, this little season where ego has potentially held sway, maybe ending around our current time, with all those vivid symbols, the beasts, the mark, the horsemen, the seals, and the bowls, being understood as different facets of this ego-driven era and the judgments that ultimately lead to the New Jerusalem, a state of restored truth and spiritual connection.
You nailed it. It's a really comprehensive and interconnected way of looking at Revelation. And while it moves away from traditional interpretations of the end times, it offers a really unique and thought-provoking perspective on history and possibly current events as well.
So here's something for you, our listeners, to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. If this interpretation, this idea of an extended little season of ego's influence that might be coming to a close now if this holds true, how might that radically change your understanding of history, not just biblical history, but all of history? And what are the implications of a potential shift away from systems built on ego toward a reality that's more aligned with truth and genuine spirituality? It's definitely a lot to think about.
A lot to think about indeed. It's been a fascinating, though at times challenging, journey exploring this particular perspective on Revelation. We hope this encourages you to reflect further and continue to engage with the rich symbolism and meaning woven throughout this ancient text.
And as always, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.
See you then.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.